Welcome to Systemic Perspective, developing an adoptable strategy for results. This is sort of an update on my relentless pursuit of figuring out how to actually get something to happen, as opposed to spending lots of time evaluating, analyzing situations, and developing answers that end up in reports that sit on the shelf and nothing ever changes. The intent for a systemic perspective is to, in fact, given a particular situation that you believe warrants attention, to develop an understanding that's appropriate to evolve a strategy which, when adopted, will in fact actually alter the situation, resolve the situation, turn it into a preferred state of things as opposed to the way that the current situation is. Though not any strategy, but a strategy that's intelligently enough developed such that it will in fact minimize the unintended consequences, because typically unintended consequences have a tendency to actually make things worse. Or if they don't actually make that situation worse, they tend to create other problems that somebody else has to solve later on. And this is done with the realization that reality is in fact complex and complicated, and often simply perceived as being complicated because of its nature, and that cause and effect are more often than not separated in either time or space, or both at the same time. Now, systems thinking is proposed as an approach to developing a better understanding of things, to in fact support this development of an intelligent strategy. Though systems thinking has in fact evolved over the years, beginning in the 30s and 40s with general systems theory, primarily from Bertalanffy, though with a number of other key individuals involved, and cybernetics from Norbert Wiener. That evolving or being integrated into something that was actually referred to as systems thinking by the International Society for System Sciences in the early 50s, though it was rapidly or quickly realized that there were some difficulties with systems thinking, and that it was unable to deal with multiple perceptions of reality. It was unable to handle extremely complex situations, and there was an inability to escape from conservative bias. Now, with each one of these limitations or issues, there were in fact new methodologies or approaches developed: soft systems methodology from Checklin, and organizational cybernetics from Beer, and emancipatory systems thinking from Ackoff and Churchman, and that eventually evolved into what we have today, which is referred to as critical systems thinking, with primary practitioners being Senge, Churchman, and Jackson being another one. Though what happens, what Jackson has put forward is not a new methodology, though more an approach to being able to understand what's likely to be beneficial in what context. So in his book, he refers to this as a system of systems methodologies. I just call it a framework. And it takes and it divides systems into two categories: simple and complex. Simple being a system that you can conceive of having designed and developed, and complex systems which seem to be so complex that they evolved over time from a lot of interactions, but you can't conceive that someone actually designed it to be the way that it turned out. So that the systems is one dimension. The other dimension is the participants, and they're divided into three categories, being unitary, pluralist, and coercive, and it's based upon the extent of the alignment of the goals, objectives, values, and beliefs of the participants being those stakeholders who are involved in the situation either because they are responsible for the situation or they're affected by the situation. Unitary in terms of goals and objectives being relatively well aligned. Pluralist in that from time to time the stakeholders can in fact develop an aligned view of things and agree on things. And coercive, where the stakeholders will in fact probably never agree on much of anything, so that based upon looking at it this way, there are categories developed, but there is a limit to what one can expect to achieve in those contexts. So in this context, unitary for simple complex, one could seek to pursue goals and validate viability, whereas in this context one can explore purpose, though in this coercive simple environment you can attempt to ensure fairness, or for coercive complex you can attempt to promote diversity. Finding yourself in this context, deciding that you actually want to pursue and achieve a goal is probably a ludicrous thought, because it just isn't going to happen. The context is such that it won't allow it to happen. So what Jackson provides is a definition of a number of contexts, and so that from a hard systems thinking perspective, you can employ operations research and systems analysis or systems engineering. From a dynamic perspective, you can use system dynamics or organizational cybernetics, complexity theory, general systems theory, viable systems model, those types of things. In this category, you employ interactive planning or soft systems methodology or strategic assumptions and surface testing. Though when you get over into these categories, it's more critical systems heuristics or teams integrity or postmodern systems thinking. Collectively, all of this ends up being encompassed in what's called critical systems thinking, being that you employ the appropriate methods, models, and theories based upon what's appropriate to the context. It isn't dogma to say that if you find yourself in this context, this is what you absolutely have to use. What the framework says is that given a particular context, this is what's likely to be beneficial, though you should think about the situation from your own actual experience in the context and determine you may in fact find yourself in this category doing something where system dynamics does in fact appear appropriate. So based upon all of this and what's evolved over time, what I put together was this approach for developing a strategy based upon beginning with a situation here, situation which results from some pattern of behavior evolving over time, which is the responsibility, which results from a set of interactions, and you establish a boundary to define who's responsible for what constitutes the system that you're going to attend to and what is part of the environment. And this here is the typical systems thinking domain, and it finally came to mind that it is in fact paying attention to this domain and ignoring the rest of it that ends up being responsible for developing solutions that never get applied or never get adopted, because it's leaving out the most critical aspects of the environment, and that being the stakeholders. So once the interactions and the boundary are identified, the stakeholders, which should have been involved in developing all of this to this point, the stakeholders challenge assumptions to ensure that the current set of understanding that they have evolved is in fact appropriate to the situation. We make assumptions based upon all of the things that we do and we take action based upon those assumptions, though we seldom ever take time to actually challenge and validate them to make sure that we are on solid ground for moving forward. So that's why the challenge assumptions piece is here. And then one has to identify the leverage points within this set of interactions with the stakeholders as a basis for developing the strategy. And it's this leverage point and strategy which in fact encompasses all of the methods, models, and theories that are within the Jackson framework. So the systemic perspective model encompasses all of the methods and models of systems thinking that have been evolved to date. And once that strategy is developed and adopted by the stakeholders, then that adopting that strategy improves that network of interactions, which changes the behavior, which changes the situation. And it was an intelligently developed strategy which minimizes the unintended consequences, so it doesn't make the current situation worse, and it doesn't create more problems that have to be solved in the future. Now, I've been asked by a number of people how it is that I put together a linear process for developing a systemic perspective. The diagram that you're looking at has 20-some odd feedback loops that I left out so it didn't look like the Afghan strategy model and became completely undecipherable. So it is in fact an iterative model where every step in the process in fact feeds back to determine whether or not something that has been previously done needs to be revised and evolved so you can continue forward. And it's a model which a single person can pursue the development of this strategy, or a group of people can pursue all of these elements and the development of a strategy. Though if the strategy is in fact to be adopted with any great likelihood, all of these components all of the stages of the process need to be done by key stakeholders who in fact are responsible for this whole network of interactions. It's based upon the realization as to why it is that people don't wash their rental cars. It's a question of ownership. So that if the stakeholders in fact develop the strategy, it is their strategy as opposed to somebody else's strategy that has to be sold to them after the fact. So that's the basis for this model, which I have numerous additional videos I'm putting together to explain each of the individual elements of this model and how one goes about actually conducting the interactions to flush them out. So hope you found this useful. Take care. See you in the next video.